The streets of Constantinople glitter with gold and sunlight, and you're part of the beauty. Silk rustles against your skin, emerald threads catching the morning light. You don't know that before the sun sets, that same silk will become your shroud. You'll be sewn into a weighted sack and thrown into the Bosphorus for daring to wear the wrong color. What kind of empire kills women for beauty? The Bosphorus ripples quietly after the sack disappears beneath the waves. No record will bear her name. No prayer will be spoken for her soul. Just another entry in the empire's invisible ledger, one more woman erased for disobedience. For over 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. We remember its splendor, the blue domes of its mosques, the geometry of its palaces, the brilliance of its calligraphy. But beneath the marble and gold, another empire existed, one built not on architecture or conquest, but on control. A control so meticulous, so bureaucratic, that it turned the female body into state property. Historians celebrate Ottoman achievements, their military discipline, their art, their governance. Yet buried in court documents and dusty archives lies a different kind of record. Legal codes written with the same precision as tax laws, but meant to regulate women. How they dressed, how they walked, even how they breathed in public spaces. These weren't moral guidelines. They were imperial commands, enforced with punishments that escalated from humiliation to death. Every law carried a message. You exist because the Sultan allows it. Under Osman III, these rules reached their cruelest perfection. Women were forbidden from wearing anything bright or beautiful, silk, embroidery, or even patterned fabric. They were ordered to shroud themselves in darkness. Muted cloth, heavy veils, plain shoes. Defiance wasn't vanity. It was rebellion, and rebellion meant death. The empire's guards didn't just watch the streets for thieves or traitors. They hunted for color, for a glint of gold thread, for silk that shone too boldly in the sun. Neighbors turned informants. Mothers warned daughters not to be too lovely. In Constantinople, beauty itself became a crime punishable by drowning. In the capital's narrow streets, fear had a rhythm, soft footsteps behind every corner, whispered warnings carried through latticed windows. Women learned to move like shadows, careful not to draw attention. Because in the Ottoman world, attention could kill. These dress codes weren't random decrees. They were the visible surface of a deeper system, one designed to police every moment of a woman's life. Imperial law dictated what they could wear, where they could go, who they could speak to, and when. Each rule was written with bureaucratic precision, as if women were another resource to be managed, like grain or land or livestock. The empire called it order. But for women, it was surveillance. Guards patrolled the markets, watching for bright colors or loose veils. A single report could end a life. One complaint, one rumor, one neighbor's jealousy, and a woman might vanish by sunset. This wasn't chaos. It was policy, a deliberate structure that transformed fear into obedience. The Sultan didn't need to watch every woman himself. The empire had trained society to do it for him. Neighbors monitored neighbors. Mothers corrected daughters. Merchants refused to sell forbidden cloth. And soon, women began policing themselves, walking smaller, speaking softer, dressing plainer, because survival depended on invisibility. For upper-class women, the cage was gilded. They lived behind carved screens and silk curtains, confined to the home for all but the most necessary outings. Even then, they moved under heavy veils, escorted by male relatives through streets they barely recognized. Each step outside was an act of negotiation with danger. The law called them maram, protected, secluded, pure. But protection was a lie that disguised imprisonment. It was a clever weapon, convincing women that their confinement was virtue, that obedience was safety, that silence was honor. And so the empire didn't just chain their bodies, it colonized their minds. What began as dress codes soon became a doctrine, a web of laws reaching deep into every woman's home, her marriage, her body. In the Ottoman world, control wasn't chaos. It was written law, stamped, signed, and sealed by the empire itself. Marriage was never about love or choice. It was about ownership. A woman's worth began and ended as property, transferred from father to husband, recorded in ledgers like livestock or land. Consent was irrelevant. A girl could be promised, traded, or sold. Her future decided before she even understood what marriage meant. Once married, she had no legal right to refuse her husband, no protection from his violence, and no claim to her own possessions. Divorce for women didn't exist in practice. Only men could initiate it. And when they did, women were left with nothing, no dowry, no home, no name that the law would defend. Even the idea of love was twisted into obedience. A good wife was silent, unseen, and unquestioning. The courts reflected this imbalance with cruel precision. A woman's testimony was worth half that of a man's, and often not admissible at all. Even when a woman stood before the judge bruised and broken, her word carried no weight unless confirmed by a man. Justice in this empire was gendered, and silence was the safest plea. Inside the great palaces, the system took on its most polished form, the imperial harem. Romanticized in art and legend as a paradise of beauty and intrigue, it was, in truth, a gilded prison. Hundreds of women, bought, captured, or given as tribute, lived behind its jeweled gates. Every breath, every movement was monitored. Every smile a calculation. Even power came at a price. A concubine who bore a son rose in rank, but her life was now tied to his. If the prince fell out of favor, she vanished with him. Status was temporary. Control was permanent. The harem was the empire's most dazzling lie. From the outside, it shimmered marble halls, silk curtains, gold-tiled fountains whispering under candlelight. But behind the fragrance of jasmine and the echo of music lay a truth too dark for paintings or poetry to capture. It wasn't a palace. It was a machine, built to turn women into property, beauty into politics, and love into currency. The hierarchy inside was ruthless. At the bottom were the Kurii, enslaved girls taken from conquered lands, stripped of names, languages, and faith. Their only purpose was pleasure. They existed at the mercy of men whose whims could end their lives before sunrise. Above them stood the favored concubines, those who had caught the sultan's eye. But even they lived with the same quiet terror, that a single mistake, a rumor, or a shift in palace politics could mean exile or execution. The empire codified this hierarchy into the infamous law of one concubine, one son. A woman could bear only one male heir, a rule meant to prevent alliances, jealousy, and rival power bases. It also meant that her worth vanished the moment her child was born. Once her son grew beyond infancy, she became disposable. If he died, so did her purpose. Even the most powerful woman in the empire, the Valide Sultan, mother of the reigning ruler, was still a prisoner. She wielded political influence, yes, but from gilded cages within palace walls. Her steps were counted, her movements guarded, her voice filtered through eunuchs and courtiers. She could command armies, yet not walk freely under the open sky. Every layer of the harem was a reflection of the empire beyond its walls, a structure of fear disguised as order, of domination wrapped in devotion. Women competed not for freedom, but for proximity to power. Because in the Ottoman world, closeness to the sultan was the closest thing a woman could have to safety. But even safety had an expiration date, and mercy was not part of imperial policy. Outside the palace, the same logic ruled every corner of the empire. What began as custom became law, and what began as law became routine. Ottoman courts kept meticulous records, not only of taxes and trade, but of punishments against women. Each lash, each execution, each drowning, logged with the same emotionless precision used to count livestock or wheat. Cruelty wasn't chaos here. It was bureaucracy. From the smallest villages to the imperial capital, the same machine turned. Judges enforced morality codes. Officials documented infractions. Clerics justified the cruelty with scripture, framing it as divine order. And communities learned to enforce it themselves, ensuring the sultans will reach even the most private household. The empire called it justice, but its true function was control, a system so complete that it no longer needed guards or decrees. Fear had been internalized. Women policed their own behavior because the price of defiance was carved into their memories. Humiliation, imprisonment, or death. Generations grew up knowing that survival required submission. Mothers taught daughters not how to dream, but how to disappear, to speak softly, to avoid eye contact, to blend into the silence. It wasn't love that shaped these lessons. It was survival. Each generation passed down the same unspoken wisdom. The less you're seen, the longer you live. The laws of the empire didn't simply punish women, they rewired the very way women thought. To be invisible became virtue. To be silent became honor. To be obedient became the only form of safety left. And through it all, the empire prospered, not in spite of its cruelty, but because of it. The control of women became a cornerstone of Ottoman stability, an unspoken pillar of governance. The system didn't just subdue half the population, it conditioned the other half to believe it was necessary. A society built on fear no longer needs chains. It becomes its own prison. Control over a woman's body was only half the empire's work. The other half was control over her mind. Education, in theory, was a privilege of the elite. But for women, it was a forbidden luxury, a door locked with iron keys of law and religion. While men debated philosophy in coffee houses and studied poetry under candlelight, women were denied the most basic form of power: literacy. A woman who could read was a danger because knowledge breeds questions, and questions lead to rebellion. So the empire replaced education with indoctrination. Girls were taught not to think, but to obey. Their lessons centered on silence: how to cook, clean, pray, and serve, skills designed not to elevate the mind, but to reinforce submission. Those few who did receive an education were usually women of the imperial household, trained only to serve the interests of the state. Even their literacy wasn't theirs, it belonged to the sultan. Every word written, every letter learned, was another chain disguised as privilege. The law reflected this contempt for female intellect. In court, a woman's testimony was worth half that of a man, a mathematical insult that turned truth into arithmetic. 2 women equaled 1 man, and in many cases even that equation didn't apply. Female testimony was dismissed entirely. Imagine standing before a judge, your body bruised, your voice trembling, your truth undeniable, and being told it counts for nothing because of who you are. Justice wasn't blind in the Ottoman Empire. It was looking straight at women and choosing not to see them. With no legal voice and no access to knowledge, women were trapped in a system that erased their very existence from history. They became invisible not only in life, but in memory. Their stories, their thoughts, their pain, all buried beneath the empire's shimmering image of order and glory. The silence wasn't accidental. It was engineered, a silence so deep it echoed for centuries. There were many ways to kill a woman in the Ottoman Empire, but none were as symbolic or as silent as drowning. It wasn't just execution. It was erasure. No blood, no body, no grave. Only the sound of water closing over a life the empire decided didn't deserve to exist. The process was chillingly organized. Royal gardeners, the same men who tended the sultan's roses, were often the executioners. They would sew the condemned woman into a weighted sack, the fabric stitched tight around her limbs. Then, under the pale light of dawn, they carried her to the Bosphorus. There were no words spoken, no last rites, just the slow rhythm of water lapping against the palace steps, and the splash that followed, echoing through the fog. Some sank within moments. Others thrashed for minutes, the heavy cloth twisting like a dark bloom beneath the surface. The executioner's mood decided how long it would take. Sometimes he'd let the sack drift a while, as if savoring the spectacle. The empire didn't just punish rebellion, it performed it. This method served a purpose beyond cruelty. It left no trace, no body to mourn, no site to sanctify. Even the sea became a tool of censorship. To the empire, the Bosphorus was not just a waterway. It was a graveyard of disobedience. One woman drowned for wearing the wrong color, another for leaving her home without permission, some for speaking too loudly or laughing too freely. Each death was both a warning and a lesson. And yet the most infamous of all came under Sultan Ibrahim, known to history as Ibrahim the Mad. When he ordered the execution of all 280 women in his harem, it wasn't law or judgment. It was whim. He wanted new concubines. So the old ones were sewn into sacks and thrown, one by one, into the water as he watched from his window, laughing. To the empire, this wasn't murder. It was maintenance. Ibrahim's massacre wasn't an anomaly. It was the logical conclusion of a system that measured a woman's worth only by her obedience, and erased her completely when that obedience ended. The empire's cruelty wasn't born of chaos. It was codified, sanctified, and enforced in the name of morality. Sexual laws, cloaked in religion, created another layer of terror. Punishments varied not by crime, but by who you were. An unmarried Muslim woman accused of improper conduct faced 100 lashes. A married one could be stoned to death. Non-Muslim women, meanwhile, received lighter sentences, a grim hierarchy of suffering built on the empire's own prejudices. Historians often point out that few of these punishments were actually carried out. But that misses the point. The fear itself was the weapon. When a single accusation could mean public torture or death, silence became the only defense. And that silence extended to the realm of wealth. Ottoman marriage law stripped women of financial autonomy. Whatever a bride brought into her marriage, gold, land, or inheritance, instantly became her husband's property. Even widows could not act freely with what little they received. They needed male guardians to manage their affairs, and those guardians often drained their estates dry. Economic dependence wasn't an accident of culture. It was strategy, a chain forged in contracts and legal codes. A woman with no money couldn't escape. A woman with no voice couldn't protest. A woman with no rights couldn't exist outside the system that oppressed her. Even the wealthy weren't immune. Aristocratic women, wrapped in silks and jewels, still lived by permission, not by power. Their husbands controlled their fortunes, their families controlled their movements, and the state controlled their image. Every layer of privilege was just another layer of the same cage. The empire called it balance, God's order, social harmony. But beneath the rhetoric lay something simpler, a centuries-long campaign to ensure that half the population could never rise. And through it all, the records remained precise, methodical, merciless. For centuries, the empire silenced women with fear. But silence isn't the same as surrender. Even within the palace walls, the so-called center of civilization, women learned to fight back in whispers, not wars. They traded messages through servants, smuggled letters in baskets of figs, and built invisible alliances stronger than any chain of command. Historians now call it the shadow politics of the harem. When laws stripped them of power, they built it in secret. When speech was forbidden, they spoke through art, poetry, and design. Every embroidered curtain, every perfume blend, every song hummed under breath carried meanings only women understood. It was code, resistance stitched into beauty. Some concubines rose higher than any general or vizier. Kozum Sultan, once a captured Greek girl, became one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. Through cunning, alliances, and unbreakable patience, she ruled the empire from behind the veil for nearly 40 years. Her word could end wars or start them. But even she knew that her throne was borrowed, not owned. Her story, like many others, ended in betrayal. Strangled in her sleep by guards acting on orders from the same system she once controlled. The empire tolerated a woman's power only as long as it served men's ambitions. The moment it didn't, it was erased. Yet the memory of resistance remained, not in statues or chronicles, but in whispers carried by time. Women who refused to bow, who loved in secret, who wrote, painted, taught, or simply survived, all defied an empire designed to consume them. And centuries later, when historians dig through the archives, they find traces, not of submission, but of endurance. Letters hidden in the bindings of prayer books. Names of women scratched into the undersides of palace tiles. Poems written in invisible ink that only reveal themselves under light. The empire may have built walls to silence them. But those walls, brick by brick, became the canvas of their rebellion. They didn't just endure history, they outlasted it. Centuries have passed since the last silk curtain of the harem fell. The palaces are museums now. The Bosphorus runs quiet. Tourists walk where women once wept. They take photos under chandeliers that once flickered over executions, and call it beauty. But the silence still lingers, not in the marble, but in the memory of what the empire buried beneath it. When you strip away the myths, the Ottoman story of women isn't one of luxury or exotic mystery. It's a ledger written in obedience, erased in blood. A civilization that claimed divine order, yet built its foundations on the suffering of the voiceless. The horror wasn't in the violence alone. It was in how ordinary it became, how entire generations of men and women accepted cruelty as culture, and silence as virtue. And that's the part history rarely teaches us. Not the events, but the habits of control. Because when power learns to disguise itself as morality, oppression doesn't die, it simply changes costume. You can still see it, can't you? In the way certain traditions police women's laughter. In how honor still decides who deserves freedom. In how the word obedient is still used as a compliment. The Ottoman Empire fell long ago. But the idea that women exist to serve, to obey, to endure, that survived. The real question is, for how much longer? Because every time a woman is told her silence is dignity, every time her worth is measured in obedience, every time her story is rewritten by those who never lived it, the empire breathes again. And maybe that's why we tell these stories, not to mourn the past, but to recognize its reflection in the present. The sea that once swallowed voices still whispers their names. If you listen closely, you can hear them, the sound of 1,000 silenced women, rising at last like a tide against history,